Well, so I'll just right away, first of all, just thank our speakers for two really thought-provoking papers. I have a couple of questions, but I defer. If anyone has questions, we can start a queue, or I can give you time to think. Okay, so very quickly, for the second paper, I was just thinking about this question that you raised about the bad news that we should shudder at, that businesses have souls, and I was thinking about all the times in organized activism against businesses that they are accused of being soulless. And so I was thinking about the potential doubleness of the claim that businesses have souls, that if they acted like they did have souls, that might not be such a bad thing. And so maybe we shouldn't just shudder at it. And then, so I want to know what you think about that possible ambivalence of that, or the ways it could get reworked. And then with reference to the Denny exhibit, I thought both of your papers were really interesting. The Denny exhibit in particular, though, seemed oddly unmediated, even pre-situationist in its contours. So I loved how the exhibit re-inhabited the room with his objects, and I loved the weirdness of it. And at the same time, it seemed odd to have to go look at an exhibit in order to explore the end of the spectatorial practice that he's depending on in order to have that exhibit. And I'm fine with paradox, so I just want to ask if that oddity is deliberate. And not that that would answer the question, but I'm curious. And whether you think, since you started with these references to processes of sensibility and perception in new media formations, whether you think that particular kind of appeal to transparency and visibility and accountability is functional or promising in our particularly altered sensorial and perceptive processes of perception, processes of sensation and perception. So I thought, so those are my questions. I can collect a couple, or you can, should we do that? Or do you want to answer not too much at length?
Just give it a go.
Oh, there you go, okay.
We have more time to think.
Yeah. This is longer. Yeah, no, of course. I mean, on the soul thing.
Maybe speak directly into the mic, because I know from the last session it was hard to hear.
Can you hear? Yeah. So you're completely right. I mean, one possible outcome of this type of analysis would be to make ethical claims and even demands of these beings. In other words, take literally and seriously their personhood and say, okay, as participants in a democratic or quasi-democratic public sphere, with rights come responsibilities, accountabilities, and so on. And I know that this is at work. I mean, it's tactically speaking, or pragmatically even, it seems to me, I don't know, maybe others have more concrete experience with this, but this seems to me to be overdetermined by the narrative. So it's not a kind of equal kind of situation.
Right.
The whole thing is overdetermined by the narrative of soullessness, which, is the old Weberian/Frankfurt School critique. And hence, the gestures of kind of humanity and friendship and so on, philanthropic or and so on, are as it were, received without suspicion. Not all the time, but more often enough to it seems to me, make it necessary or useful to remind ourselves that what we're dealing with is a kind of monster, and you can make friends with a monster, but at some point you don't, and so that would be that. But so I think I would translate that as a tactical question, but from the let's say epistemological point of view, I do think it's, in discursive point, it's overdetermined by. You could even say that speaking of universities, it's one of the great struggles, of course, for the humanities now, is what after all, in the corporate university is is the function of the humanities? Well, to provide the soul, the ethical correct. That's what Wiener and all these cyberneticians wanted to do. You know, the bombs were going off the camps that you know had happened. All of these things that caused a kind of ethical crisis for scientists, technologists, and so on, led to the institutionalization of the humanities at places like MIT, but not without, as it were, risk. And I'm wanting to point to that risk. But anyway.
Thank you. Do you have
Yeah, there are two great questions, so I can only start grappling for some answers. I also found it odd, I have to say, but also strangely appealing because of that oddness. And if you want, at the current Biennale, if you want to see the other side of taking, I mean, digital remediation seriously, there's also Hito Steil's piece, which is very interesting in going the other way, if you want. I do think it's consciously done. First of all, it's the site specificity of the library, which perhaps calls for a particular response. But also, if you look at his other works that I know, he is rematerializing, I guess, either the outcomes of or process or immaterial processes themselves in a very conscious way. I'm not sure that means it cannot be as complex as if it would take technological possibilities seriously. I guess there would be a large art theoretical argument to have whether these kinds of linear narrative of we are now post-situationist and post-media and everything that falls before is kind of not up to the task. So I have serious doubts about that argument. With regard to then the related question of accountability, I don't think it's that didactical and pedagogical, actually. I wanted to talk about it, but I didn't have enough time, especially Dennis' earlier exhibition are very ambivalent. And he has been accused of being too close to new media entrepreneurship. And he expressed in words he admires new media entrepreneurs. He finds them spectacularly interesting people. And in basically staging their objects and their desires and kind of the material they work with, you get put into a very ambivalent situation because there is obviously some kind of adoration going on, which I think it's also a good kind of artistic strategy to make you think, right? Rather than simply perform the absurdity and the negativity of it all. Is that a kind of a first answer to your question?
Yeah, it's very good. Thank you. So we have a few people forming a queue. Wendy, and then you, I believe, right? And then, I'm sorry, I don't know everybody by name, but I'm pointing referentially. Go.
So take them all together? Probably?
Let's
Try,
see.
that's up to you.
I think,
Yeah.
I think we better. We only have 10 minutes left.
Okay.
Yeah.
So first of all, thank you both for really fantastic papers. I'm going to start with my question to Reinhold, because what was really interesting by your description of the university as corporation was the question of gender. And if you take your analysis, which is based in the examples you give very much of the 19th century in a single-gendered university,
Mostly, yeah.
and then try to think about it in light of the sexual harassment cases that are happening now, which seem to give the lie of the college as a corporate mother.
Of course, yeah.
It strikes me as a perfect opportunity to grapple with the changes or the crisis of both the university and the corporation precisely through these issues that are now bubbling up, and reworking what even delinquency means and what delinquency is accepted and unaccepted. And of course, genders there in Turing as well. I mean, there's a whole line. Is it male or female as opposed to human or not? And then just to take something that you've touched on and to map it onto Timon and pose a question for Timon, what's really interesting about Wiener is he's obsessed with the devil rather than God, right?
Manichaean, yeah.
Yeah, is it Manichaean or is it Augustinian? And he decides it's Augustinian because it's random. And if it's random, therefore things can't remain. And it struck me that looking at the examples that you showed, there's such an emphasis on youth culture, which has been talked about many times in terms of gamers, et cetera, but it also seems seems to be caught up with the idea within the security entertainment complex that things will remain without aging. That, in other words, in order for information to remain, which is itself non-conservative, there's a dream somehow it can remain without aging and therefore always remain useful. And therefore, Google, et cetera, executives are trying to live forever and investing in that kind of materiality as well. But to what extent this notion of security entertainment also deals with this idea of remaining without aging, which is therefore so stark next to the museum, which is meant to remain in a very different way, is really intriguing and perhaps gets to some of the imperceptibleness that you're drawing out really beautifully.
All right.
Okay.
Maybe you want to start now?
Well, we're gonna
Oh,
link
well, we're gonna
four
go right,
questions.
that's
You're
right.
gonna
Keep going.
do this superhuman thing of answering all four questions at the same time. Go ahead.
Hi, thanks for your paper. It's a question for Reynold. Your description of the organon and the way you take it from a Deleuze reading, Aristotelian reading of Deleuze. And there are various ones. There's also a Platonic one, which would obviously be different. This flattening of technology, techne, or practice, and logic, allows you to get to this reading of corporation as having a soul. But what does it mean to have a soul? Once you reduce logic to practice, obviously the soul is not thinking. So Deleuze's question was, if corporations have a soul, what kind of thinking they are doing? And the thinking that they're doing, and we know that we have somehow in critical theory of technology, seems to me we have arrived to an impasse where the affective model of practice or resistance or whatever, and the kind of affective understanding of the logic arrives to this, as arrived to a deadlock where we cannot imagine a corporation, an anti-corporative model, because we embrace thinking as affect. Okay.
Over here.
Thanks. That was fun. Of course, the network and the corporation, I guess, are the two biggest kind of figures of organization that we know. The curious thing I find today is that bureaucracy. Yeah, the corporate bureaucracy, I guess. Yes. But what I find curious today is how they work together, right? That you have this corporate personhood that's kind of hollowed out, and then you have it functioning in kind of network ways, so, in supply chains and so on. So I'm wondering how we can think the two together. And one thing I'm curious about is if the contractual helps us there, because the case with Dartmouth is, of course, that it establishes the contractual beyond that the contract to found the college is more important than the rights of the state to kind of do something else with it, right? And then the person comes on top of that, and it seems that the contractual is totally missing in the network in a sense, because nobody reads the terms and conditions, and also nobody the people that work with these networks, the way they use them, don't care about contracts. And so I'm wondering if we need a kind of I'm not sure that's a good question, but if we need kind of a media theory of contracts. And we have some stuff on law, of course, with Cornelia Wissmann and that kind of stuff, but I'm not sure we have what else we have and how central the contractual would be there. Thanks.
Okay, last question, and can I ask you to try to be brief so we have a couple of minutes each for the responses?
Yes, so it's very brief. So I'm interested in this connection. I mean, when you start that organizations have, let's say, two phases or two levels. So one is a legal construction that might be a fiction of a person that is a fiction. And the other is this kind of incorporation or embodiment in architectural sites. And it's interesting, so when it comes to this question of rebellion, love and hate, so it's mostly directed to the sites. So it's very rarely legal fights. We have it also, but on some level, I mean, let's say the rebellion starts with taking the materialized object. And so isn't this part of this, let's say, paradoxical construction of the organization that beyond of this kind of formal structure, it has also a kind of materiality that presents itself in a building or in objects in the art field, where you have also the problem, I mean, the paradox as a concept art, that it still, I mean, is doing objects. So, and this is what we see. So it's in the glass box, but it's still something there. So I wonder if this moment of materiality has to do with where can we really, I mean, let's say, go into this kind of effect stages of rebellion, I mean, which is more than just to say it's unjust and I do a legal fight.
Okay.
Okay, so I can just offer you each, I can offer you each a couple of minutes to respond, but I do want to say this, I don't think it's necessary to respond to every question. If you have something you want to say by way of conclusion, and then we continue the conversation over lunch, and everyone knows what the ideas are on the table. So take 2 minutes each.
Go ahead, yes.
Wendy, that's a very good question, and really kind of, I cannot get my head around it at the moment. I see, of course, what you're after, this remaining without aging and how it might be mapped onto the security entertainment complex. I think with what I found, I have to think about it, maybe over lunch, what I found more striking with regard to the exhibition, but more obviously in your face striking, is the question of knowledge and power. Because in that library, actually in the 16th century, they collected each and every book that was being published. So it housed the knowledge, or if you want, the written information of the world. And of course, it is a very obvious, but still interesting gesture to house the server racks, the NSA. But I don't know if that leads us somewhere with regard to your question. Armin, very briefly, yeah. I mean, my first reaction is, have you ever read the small print in written contracts? Also never. So in that sense, one question is there anything new about this kind of non-reading of contractual documents in networked conditions with regard to earlier? I'm not sure about that, actually. But other than that, of course, I find the idea to look at the history, you mentioned Fissmann, at the history of organization through media, through paper, right, through files. Ben Kafka's book on the demon of writing, for instance, as kind of an explanation of how bureaucracy works and where bureaucracy fails. That would be a wonderful lifelong project to have, actually.
Yeah, okay. So I'll try to combine a few things, but so on the question of gender and sexuality, yes, absolutely. One way to think this question, you know, kind of to combine this with the problem of materiality and the sites of organization, disorganization, so on, including the way, as you say, Wendy, that, you know, that there are prohibitions and then there's everything else, and there's you know, in other words, the sanctioned kind of delinquency, and then there's sort of, you know, there's a line. So where people sleep is a continuous problem through this whole period of the transition. You know, there's mostly boys' colleges in the early 19th century. There's a couple that are, one or two become co-ed. Oberlin is co-ed quickly. And, you know, Vassar was founded and so on. But one of the patterns is that the graduate schools are more likely the laboratory, the site of practice. And the other kind of organon, the Baconian one. See, I was deliberately referring both to the Aristotelian and the Baconian, the, you know, logical and the practical or empirical. So it's actually in the sites of laboratory practice that women are, and also non-white men are admitted to these bodies. And the sort of, let's say, the limiting moment is where people sleep, and that's why residential colleges are always about gender and sexuality, not only in terms of their you know, who's there and who's not, but also in their libidinal economy and their politics, including the sort of events and tendencies that are currently being grappled with. One more thing, maybe just to add on the legal, you know, versus material, or you know, we were talking about. I mean, one way to say this is that perhaps there ought to be a social contract appended to this, you know, or addressed to this fiction. This is what, you know, your first question was about. That took advantage of the legal traditions you're referring to. That may be for scholars of the law to sort out. But I do think that the you know, there are questions that are posed as to the constitution of society, and you know, when something like a business or a corporation becomes a member of a society in some way, then there are some pretty serious, you know, as it were, existential questions to ask as to what constitutes society, including the nature of the social contract. So it would be, okay, translate existing contract law, including ethical standards and so on, into that domain is one thing. But I think it does trouble in a meaningful way and a challenging way, hence the shudder, the premise of the law as such. But that would be a longer conversation. Anyway.
Okay, so I'm sorry that I need to call the panel to an end, but I encourage the conversation to continue, and join me please in thanking our speakers.
All right. That's good. The Fred Turner thing,